Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this installment of the Jess Usher Memorial Lecture Series. By the way, my people, make sure my roll sheet is the one you sign. The emperors of the Tang Dynasty in China are probably the first to have eaten a frozen milk concoction made with cow, goat, or buffalo milk that was heated with flour, and camphor, an aromatic substance harvested from evergreen trees, added to enhance the texture and the flavor. The mixture was then placed into metal tubes and lowered into an ice pool until frozen. In medieval Near East, Arabs drank an iced refreshment called sharabt, which we know as sherbet, often flavored with cherry, pomegranate, or quince. Antonio Latini, working for a Spanish viceroy in Naples, is credited with the first person to write down a recipe for sorbetto, or sorbet, all of which gives truth to the saying, who doesn't like ice cream? This evening, we have the great good opportunity to have fact separated from fiction. Originally from Jacksonville, Florida, Dr. Dave Nelson graduated with a bachelor's degree in history from the University of North Florida and then completed a master's in public history and his PhD from the Florida State University. Go Noles. He sponsors the Model United Nations team, the History Club, and the Film Club. Dr. Nelson founded the Scotland Study Abroad program, which has subsequently become part of the University System of Georgia's European Council International Offerings. Dr. Nelson also chairs the Carter Arts and Lecture Series Committee, and in 2018, he won the prestigious ABAC Meritorious Faculty Award. With some insights into our just desserts, ladies and gentlemen, it is my distinct pleasure to introduce the Scholar of Sorbet and the Doctor of Desserts. Ladies and gentlemen, Dave Nelson.
Thanks, man. All that, and it's just a history lecture. What's wrong with you? Thursday night, you're here for a history. So hopefully what you're here for is at the end, and you probably just said this, but at the end, we should have at least a little bit of ice cream for people. So as you go out, there should be a little ice cream for you to take. Perfect night for it. It's a nice cold night, which actually in Scotland, this really would be when you would want to eat some ice cream. So tonight we're going to talk a little bit about ice cream in Scotland. And this is a weird project that I kind of just sort of came across when I was actually doing a bit of research on a totally different project that I actually presented here a few years ago about Christmas in Scotland. I've been going to Britain for a long time. First time I went was 2005. I think it's about 19, 20 trips now doing the Scotland Study Abroad program, which you can do a drinking game. How many times I mentioned that tonight? But again, if you ever get a chance to go to Britain, whether you go with me to Scotland, or on your own, or through the London Study Abroad program, or you go with Dr. Schmeiser to Ireland, and then you do a weekend trip to Scotland, whatever, however you might want to do it, you will notice that ice cream is a huge part of British culture. I mean, they really do eat it all the time. And again, it doesn't matter whether it's cold, whether it's hot, whether it's rainy. And this is, of course, what you want to get. This is the flake cone. So you got your ice cream cone, you got your ice cream, and then a bar that you don't get much around here, but it's known as a flake bar. You stick it in the ice cream, and you got your perfect dessert. So you may have been paying attention to British politics over the last few years. They've had an independence vote. They had the Brexit vote. They've gone through 3 prime ministers this year. And they have a really weird relationship with the media and their politicians. They love to get photos of politicians eating. And it actually does affect the elections. And the thing they love to get more than anything else is British politicians eating ice cream. So there are tons of photos. This is Boris Johnson, former mayor of London, just was prime minister till this summer. This is the first minister of Scotland, the conservative leader in Scotland. So again, ice cream is part of politics. It's part of life. It's even part of theater. So again, we're not eating ice cream tonight because we want to keep the theater nice. We're going to wait till you leave. But if we were in Britain, we would be eating it right now. We wouldn't wait till afterwards. These are some of the ice cream flavors you can find specifically in Scotland. Some of these should sound familiar, chocolate, strawberry, chocolate mint. But then you get Scottish tablet, honeycomb, raspberry ripple. Scottish tablet, by the way, if you ever get a chance to go, it's basically fudge, but really good fudge, like much better than what you're probably used to getting. So this summer, I took students to Scotland for the first time in a couple of years. And one of the things we did is we went to this theater, the King's Theater, a theater that was built in the early 1800s. We saw a version of Wuthering Heights. I don't know if he's here tonight, so maybe I won't embarrass him, but you see this person right there, the hat on the lower right. That's the vice president of SGA for here at ABAC. He's from Bainbridge campus. And if you zoom in, I was just taking a picture of the stage. He's eating ice cream. One of our students is in a premier theater, and he had the nerve to eat ice cream. But of course, actually, we're all eating ice cream. I got ice cream on my lap when I took this photo, because when you go to these old theaters, I took my son after the program to see some plays. This is where we saw Les Mis. That's us posing there. Just sneaky shot of my son there. But every one of these plays, we saw 4 plays in 2.5 days. Every play, we got ice cream halfway through it. In fact, what would normally happen is after I talked for a bit, the lights would come on, and people would come out, and they would sell you ice cream. And you would eat it, and then you'd watch the rest of the play, or even the rest of the movie. And nobody really knows when exactly they started doing this. People, it seems to be early 20th century, or even why specifically ice cream, other than they just seem to really love it. I think it's because they don't have air conditioning, in all seriousness, and it gets really hot in these theaters. So I think it's a way to cool people off. But again, my point is, this is such a part of British culture, even more, I think, than American culture as far as the love of ice cream and how important it is. Which why it makes it so weird that there was a time in the late 1800s and early 1900s where specifically in Scotland, there was a real fear of ice cream. I discovered this, I was doing some research, again, when I was doing the Christmas research a few years ago about Christmas in Scotland. They have a really weird relationship with Christmas. They didn't celebrate it for about 300 years. I was at the Mitchell Library in Glasgow, which is a wonderful public library, and they have a great archive of the city of Glasgow, and they have a lot of cool stuff. So I was in there looking through stuff, and I kept seeing, I was looking for Christmas stuff. So I was looking at December for every year, the newspapers, government records, and every so often I see something about ice cream, and at first I was like, whatever. And then after a while I was like, why do I keep seeing headlines with the phrase ice cream in it? So finally I started looking at this stuff, and here is regulation of ice cream shops, conference in Glasgow, a whole conference of all the major leaders of Glasgow. What are we going to do about ice cream shops? Or I saw this publication, again, this is from 1909, that having regard to the great and increasing evil to the youth, male and female, of the city of Glasgow and the country through their frequenting ice cream shops, and to the fact that the provisions of the borough police doesn't give us enough power, we got to do something about ice cream. And I realized there's actually a story here, a story I never really would have thought much about. And again, so much of research just comes from the serendipity. So anybody who wants to be a history major, or political science major, lit major, anything that involves research, stay on target, but never be afraid to follow those little side roads. Sometimes you'll end up something better than you were originally doing. And so I assumed this was just going to be a weird side road that would have a dead end. And so I kind of put it away, made a note. Next year, I went back to the National Archives of Scotland, which is just a couple of blocks from where we stay for the Study Abroad program. So we walk by this every single day if you do the program. And I went in there and talked to the archivist. And I said, I want to look up ice cream shops. And they were like, excuse me? And then the archivist came back about 30 minutes later and said, we have a lot. And you could tell he had no idea. I don't know why, but we have a whole lot about ice cream shops. And then this past year, actually not that long ago, I was able to make it to Edinburgh City Archives for the first time. And this is the main drag in Edinburgh, so it's just right there on the right. And I got to go there, and again, they had tons of stuff on ice cream. So I managed to write this up, did it at a conference up in Canada a couple years ago, up in Guelph, which I'd never heard of until I started doing this conference. By the way, again, since it's mostly students tonight, and I'm a historian, so I'm going to pretend you're all historians. I know you're not. But if you want to go into history, one of the things you might want to try to find is what's an area that nobody else is doing? And then you become the expert on that. And Scottish history is actually a good field to go into. I wish I had done it. I'm an American historian that does environmental history and public history. I've only kind of fallen into Scottish history, as I've gotten old. But it's a really tiny field. There's a lot of British historians, a lot of British lit professors. But you get talking to them, and most of them do English history, English lit, maybe even a little Irish lit or a little Irish. But you get into Scotland, so it's a really tiny field. So if you're looking to go into an area, Again, if I could go back in time, I would actually do Scottish history. And I remember I was doing this conference, a different paper, and I made just a quick criticism of another historian. Just, oh, this guy said this, he was wrong. And it was a crowd even smaller than this. And a few minutes later, somebody went, I was like, oh, yeah, what do you need? I just tweeted him. He said he didn't know why he did that. You're right, he's wrong. What, you know the guy? And everybody in the room knew the guy. And I realized, oh my gosh, this is such a tiny little world. So anyway, if you want to be an expert, go into Scottish history because there's not many people doing it. Okay. And again, this is the origin of this paper. And it did get published in a little journal. I'm going to do a truncated version. I'm hoping to turn it into a book, but maybe I'll gauge your reaction tonight whether I really want to do that or not. Okay, so I'm going to insult maybe some of y'all's intelligence, but I know when I was younger, I always got Ireland and Scotland and UK and Britain all mixed up. To me, it was all one big thing. So real quick, so this is the United Kingdom. This is Ireland and the island of Britain, but we're talking about Scotland tonight, and we're mostly just talking about this area for the most part. So Britain is the entire island, so if you're British, you're from that island, but it has 3 countries, Wales, England, and Scotland. We're mostly going to be talking about Scotland tonight, with just a little bit of England. And like I said, we're mostly going to be looking at Glasgow and Edinburgh, which is kind of the central belt. We'll mention a couple of these other cities, but the reality is Scotland is almost everybody lives here, and most of that is completely empty. It's pretty much just mountains, and fields and such. It's really a pretty empty country. Scotland's about 5 million people today. England, which is not much bigger, is about 55 million people, just to put that into perspective. So again, Scotland's a much, much smaller country, hence why you may not get a lot of Scottish historians. The time period we're talking about is late 1800s, early 20th century, and I'm kind of getting into Galt Brown's area, so I'm not an expert on this period in the way he is. But we're really talking about the Victorian era. Queen Victoria was over the British Empire at this point, to be followed by, I believe it's Edward VII, and then King George V. So this is really the era we're talking about. And it's kind of appropriate that I mentioned Queen Victoria, and I'm wearing Scottish tweed tonight, and we're eating some ice cream, because really one of the reasons we know a lot about Scotland in this country, and people do go to Scotland, and they talk about clans with a C, clans and plaid, which they call tartan, and kilts and all of that, is really because of Queen Victoria. Her family was German, but she spent a lot of time in Scotland, and whatever a monarch does, everybody else starts to imitate it, and suddenly everyone got really into Scotland. Scottish writers, Scottish art, everybody wanted to dress like Scotland. Scotland made sure they started selling stuff. They made up half the stuff that we consider Scottish today just to appease the tourists. So the reason we talk about Scotland a lot actually is Queen Victoria. So we've had students, this is a student from ABAC a couple years ago. He went all the way with his kilts. Fortunately, he learned how to sit with a kilt and not embarrass himself. Anyway, so we're going to talk mostly about these 2 cities, Glasgow and Edinburgh. See, I'm just really trying to show you some pictures of Scotland, get you excited about it. One other thing I want to mention real quick, it won't be a big thing, but I do want to talk a little bit about the government for 2 seconds. Since I am part of the history and political science department, we do a lot on government. So at this time, Scotland was really almost more like an area of Britain. It is its own country, but at this point, Scotland didn't really have as much control over its affairs as it used to have back in the 1600s, or even that it has today. So essentially, you have a monarch, Queen Victoria, King Edward. You have a prime minister, sort of like a president, that represents the monarch to Parliament, which is like our Congress today. Under that, for Scotland, you would have basically one person who was the Secretary for Scotland. And that person was sort of the liaison between Scotland and Parliament. So anything Scotland wanted to do, as they needed a law, they had to go to the Secretary, who then went to Parliament. And when they wanted to get rid of ice cream shops, or at least regulate them, they had to go to the Secretary of Scotland, who then went to Parliament. And at this point, Parliament controlled like a third of the world practically, and they're talking about ice cream shops for quite a bit of the time. And then at the local level, you would have mayors, Lord Provosts, town councils, and all of that. They were the ones that were so upset over ice cream shops. Everybody else thought they were crazy for this. And just real quick, today, Scotland does have a lot more power. They do actually have their own prime minister. They call it the first minister. They have their own parliament today, and they still have local authorities. So today, this would be a very easy story for them, because they would have just outlawed ice cream shops and been done with it. But because they had to go through Parliament, and maybe even the Prime Minister at times to make some of these decisions, it became a much bigger issue. And Parliament's not going to do what they wanted them to do. All right, so again, if you're to look at newspapers in Scotland, 1880, 1890, 1900, again, this would be a very typical kind of article you might see. You would see these sometimes in America as well, in London, but nowhere near as much as Scotland. So when I first discovered this, I kept thinking, okay, I knew Italians were really the ones that were making the ice cream in Scotland. They were the immigrants. And I teach American history. I know we had a lot of problems with immigrants, fear of immigrants, a lot of problems with what to do about immigrants, and people were, they're foreigners, xenophobia, in other words, fear of foreigners. So I assume this is just xenophobia, and that is a part of the story. But it turns out ice cream actually can be dangerous. And remember, I and Dr. Brown are not responsible for anything that happens to you when you eat that ice cream tonight. But ice cream really actually could be at one time a dangerous thing. So some of these fears weren't completely wrong. And so it's a little more complex of a story than you might think. So this is the mayor, essentially the mayor, the Lord Provost of Glasgow, and Samuel Chisholm. And he was one of the big leaders arguing to get rid of ice cream, because he thought this is one of the most dangerous things, and it was literally ruining Scottish youth. So the fears we're talking about are health fears, which is real a little bit, as you'll learn. Xenophobia, the fear of foreigners. In this case, the fear of Catholics, the fear of Italians. Crime, there's a little bit of truth to that, but not much. But they're arguing that people go to ice cream shops, and then they commit murder, they commit robbery, they do horrible things. Loss of morality and religion. The fact that our youth are they've been saying this, I think, for 1,000 years. Kids today, they're not like we used to be. Today it would be the kids and their TikTok, and kids and basically, if I know what it is, you're probably not using it anymore. It's probably some new thing, but it used to be video games, it used to be rock and roll. At this point, it was ice cream. And finally, what I actually think is the real answer is the fear of modernity. The world was changing. It was becoming industrial. There was new technologies, new influences. People weren't going to church as much as they had been. And I think ice cream just becomes Italians and ice cream become the convenient scapegoat for much deeper fears, deeper changes that are actually happening in Scotland. So it's not really always about the ice cream, it turns out. It's about other things. This is what we call moral panic. Anybody who takes my class, you've heard me talk about these quite a bit. This is one of my themes I often go back to as a historian. It's a sociological term, but we use it a lot in history. But essentially, it can be an issue, maybe even a legit issue, and often maybe even a completely false issue, that people exaggerate and blow up out of proportion. But they also expect the government, society, to do something about this issue. The classic example would be the Salem witch trials. There was a brief period where everybody kind of panicked, everyone's a witch, the government got involved, they had these trials, there were some executions, and then a little over a year later, it calms down, and actually within 10 years, Massachusetts apologized for the Salem witch trial. So there is usually a pattern with these. And we do see a couple of moral panics in Scotland, specifically over ice cream. So this is what we're talking about. A little small shop run by an Italian family that makes and sells ice cream. Maybe they sell fish and chips. Maybe they sell some other foods. This is the root of Scottish evil at this point. But actually, restaurants are always a good gateway for immigrant groups. We see it here. Today, it's not so much Italian immigrants, but maybe immigrants from Pakistan, India, somewhere in northern Africa, perhaps. Running shops like kebab shops or curry shops selling Indian food or Chinese food shops. These are the modern-day ice cream shops. And they're not as feared as ice cream was, but they are still a little bit feared. And again, I'll show you why in a little bit. All right, so we're going to talk a little bit about background, talk a little bit about those health fears, the criminal moral fears, and what they actually tried to do about it. So it is weird to think that there was a time when there was no ice cream. Dr. Galt Brown gave you a really quick history, which I'm glad he did, so I don't have to do all that. But it is weird that, this is something that had to be invented. And we can do this with all the foods. If I asked you guys to describe British society, like we were in the classroom and I could actually talk to you guys, I bet at some point tea would come up. And they really do drink tea like crazy in Britain, no matter what the problem is. You got cancer? Oh, let me give you a cup of tea. Oh, you're cured of cancer? Oh, let's have a cup of tea. You got a job? Cup of tea. Oh, you got fired? Oh, let's have a cup of tea, Well, there was a time before tea was in Britain. In fact, when people go over, a lot of times they're kind of disappointed that you don't see tea shops everywhere you go. Although my study abroad students get to go to tea shops. But really, when you go out in Britain, it's all coffee shops that you actually see, not so much tea shops. There was a time before coffee showed up in Britain. Coffee shows up around the 1500s in Britain. Shakespeare wrote a lot of his plays in a coffee house. So there was a Starbucks before there was, I just want to blame it on tea. Before there was a Tetley's, there was a Starbucks in Britain, basically. And by the way, some historians and others think that maybe all this caffeine that was coming into Western Europe, coffee and then tea, might have played a little bit of a role in some of the advances of that time. Because all that caffeine, all that concentration, who knows? Of course, coffee originally comes from Northern Africa. Again, it starts arriving in Europe around the 1500s. Tea is the same way. It's from China originally. It also starts showing up in England and Scotland around the 1500s. But hardly anybody drank tea until King Charles II, a Scottish king, actually. He and his wife drank a lot of tea. And again, what a monarch does, people like to imitate. So suddenly everybody started drinking tea in England and Scotland. Now today, by the way, you don't see a lot of tea shops, you see a lot of coffee shops. The pattern is you drink tea at home, and when you go out, you have coffee. We tend to be almost the opposite here. And also sugar. What are you going to put in that tea or ice cream? Sugar was a pretty new thing, also from China originally, and also doesn't show up till about the 1500s. So again, what we're talking about is a fairly recent thing. And of course, ice cream itself has its origins in Asia. Lastly, if you're going to make ice cream, what are you going to put in it? I mean, of course, the two main flavors are vanilla and chocolate. In fact, vanilla is so ubiquitous that we tend to use the term vanilla like, you're boring. You live a vanilla life. You're not adventuresome, When at one time, this was exotic. This was the exciting food because Europeans had never had vanilla. And of course, chocolate and vanilla both come from Central America. In fact, both words are Nahuatl words. In other words, words spoken by the Nahua, who you know as the Aztecs probably. So again, it's not till pretty late that we start getting all these things together. But ice cream comes even later for Britain. So this idea of making a liquid into this not quite hard ice, but something that's sort of like really cold pudding, this kind of smooth substance, was seen as like this crazy magical process that if you didn't know the secret, you didn't know how anybody did it. And so if you just decide to make some ice cream, you got some milk and vanilla and some sugar, and you mixed it together and put it in the freezer, what you got is just a mess. That's just a big, hard mess is all you would have. It would not be ice cream. But it was in China and India where they started figuring this out. There is a little secret recipe here. So the initial stuff that comes out was basically sherbet, which is basically ice cream without the milk. So you may have had a dreamsicle before, so it's sherbet surrounding ice cream. The process is exactly the same, just different ingredients in it. So of course, the secret to making ice cream is salt. Which when I was a kid, my parents used to make it, and I was like, weird. And I'd eat it and like, where's the salt? But of course, what salt does is you put the rock salt around the container holding your ingredients, and then you have ice, and that salt is actually pulling the heat out. This is why you put rock salt on roads like up north to keep it from icing. Because basically what the salt does, and I'm at the end of my chemistry knowledge here, but what it does is basically it allows water and liquids to go below 32 degrees and not freeze. It's like magic. And so that's the secret little part. And so if you knew how to make ice cream, you didn't tell anybody that part because you were going to make a good living making ice cream and nobody would know what the secret of it was. So suddenly through the Middle East and then through Italy and France and eventually into Northern Europe, chefs learned the secret. And if you knew how to make ice cream or sherbet, you were going to have a good life. As far as Europe is concerned, the first indication of how to do this was actually an Italian book called Natural Magic. And of course, magic is just a way to control nature. That's the idea of magic. You put things together, poof, something happens. Much of what they used to call magic, today we call chemistry or physics or cooking even. I mean, I still don't quite know how a cake comes out of eggs, flour, vegetable, and somehow it turns into a cake. But it works every time, right? So this book actually taught the magic part of the salt. They didn't know why it worked. It's just that was the magic potion. But it was a pretty closely guarded secret of actually how to make ice cream. So again, chefs that knew how to do this got very famous. And there are places like here in Paris where people like Napoleon and Dickens in later years and others would go just to eat their ice cream and their sherbet and such. So for Britain, it never really took off until a monarch died. So in Britain, you have a Scottish family that controls Britain from 1603 to about 1715, the Stuart family. When the last one died, Queen Anne, she didn't have any kids. They all died. Her husband had died. So she was it. So when she died, a brand new family was brought in to rule Britain. And the chef for Queen Anne wasn't hired by the new family. So she decided to publish a book that actually had all the recipes that she used to cook for Queen Anne. And that included the recipe for ice cream. So really for England and Scotland, this is really the first time that people started going, oh, that's how you do it. But even then, it didn't really take off. In the colonies, it did. So in America, Georgia, and the colonies of Virginia, Massachusetts, making ice cream became a common thing. By the time we're in the United States, it's a big part of 4th of July. But in Britain, it remained sort of an elite, kind of a rich person's food, even though it was out there. And even then, you almost don't get any mentions of ice cream almost until the 1800s. Early 1800s, you start seeing a few advertisements. It's 1802, and it talks about, we're going to have some jellies and ice cream here. Like, it's a special thing. We're actually going to have some ice cream here. By the way, I used to do a turtle program and when I was a park ranger, so I purposely kept in the turtle part up top. Turtles were a huge delicacy coming from places like the Galapagos Islands and what is now Florida and such. So ice cream was up there with the sea turtles that were quite rare in Britain. And by the way, that's the earliest mention of ice cream anywhere in Scotland that I could find, and it's actually this pub where they were selling the first ice cream, a pub that I used to take students to for an opening meal. We actually go somewhere else now, so we have a weird connection with it. So we start seeing some other advertisements. Again, this is 1804, talking about we're going to have pastry, jellies, ice cream, lemon cream, Italian, So again, we're starting to see some of these nice restaurants advertising this. Another one, a grocer advertises he's going to have some ice. You can see that at the bottom, ice cream, ginger beer, pastry. But essentially, it still remained an elite thing to do. It was expensive to get sugar. It was expensive to get the ice because you didn't have modern refrigeration. Again, a lot of chefs didn't want to tell people how they made it. So it took Italians showing up before ice cream started to become something that common people would do. So there's a publication that came out in London in the 1850s that described London at that point, mostly describing the poor areas. And it talks about ice cream a little bit, but it talks about how expensive ice cream was and how rare it was for people to actually eat ice cream. But when Italians began to show up in the mid-1800s, Italy was starting to reunify to become a one nation again after a long time of being divided up. But they were going through a lot of problems. Taxes, bad harvest, there was even a couple of earthquakes in the 19th century. So there was some real poverty in southern Italy in particular. So there is a huge exodus of Italians between about 1840s until about 1930. Over 20 million Italians will end up leaving, mostly coming to the US, Canada, Australia, a little less to England, and a little bit to Scotland, which is why it's so weird how much Scotland reacted to these Italian immigrants, much more so than we see in some of these other countries. Now, in Scotland, it's mostly men coming over. We're not seeing a lot of women at first, and I think that's going to play a little bit of a role in what happens in Scotland. The numbers are never very big. I mean, 1861, a little over 100. Even as late as 1911, the official count is still under 5,000 people. So we're talking a really tiny group of people. And yet, there's going to be this huge reaction. So the jobs that they did in England and Scotland when they first came over, and we're talking very poor people. Most of them uneducated, most of them illiterate, most of them couldn't speak English very well, if at all. But they did have a few skills. And one of the things that they did, some of them, was they were statue makers. So they would make Jesuses and Mother Marys. But in Scotland, even though you could be Catholic, it wasn't against the law anymore, but Scotland was a strict Protestant, mostly Presbyterian country. They didn't like God and Mother Mary. They didn't care about Mother Mary at all anyway, but they didn't want Jesus statues, because that was idolatry. That's why you go to Scotland, there's no statues. It's not like going to Italy and you see these beautiful churches. It's very plain there, because they got rid of all the art. So they were in trouble. They were like, uh-oh. So what they decided to do was, for Jesus, they would just turn all their Jesuses into John Knox, who was the Protestant leader of the Presbyterian Church of Scotland. And for Mother Mary, they just turned her into Queen Victoria. They're like, no, it's not Mother Mary, it's Queen Victoria, really skinny Queen Victoria. So that was one of their jobs. But the main job that these Italians did was organ grinding. Hurdy-gurdies and organs, maybe have a dancing monkey that would ask for money. This became kind of the stereotypical Italian immigrant in places like London and Glasgow and Edinburgh. And they were despised by a lot of people because they made a lot of noise. They were always asking for money. So there was a lot of articles about these Italians coming in with their loud music and begging on the streets. So there was a big kind of turn against them. They were Catholic. They were different culture. They were poor. So there was a lot of reasons that many British people had some problems with Italians at this point in their minds. But you notice there's a lot of kids in some of these images that are actually doing some of the music. This is a system called the Padrone system. Terry Colby was one of the few historians to actually look at Italians in Britain. She called this virtual slavery. It's a master-apprentice system where maybe somebody comes over, he can speak good English and has some connections, and they bring young people, maybe even kids over, train them in the job, and then hopefully they do their own thing. It could be a great system, but it was very much abused. And so I bring that up because that starts to become the image of Italians by the British. They're corrupt, they're ruining Italian youth, and if they're ruining Italian youth, what do you think they'll do to our youth? Right? If you've ever read Dickens and you've read Oliver Twist, you may know the character of Fagin, which is it's a great book, but it's a horrible Jewish stereotype. But actually, to some degree, Fagin was actually based on these Italian immigrants and this Padrone system, a person corrupting youth, turning them into thieves and things like that. So again, this is obviously the Jewish stereotype from an early movie, but think Italian. And this is the image of Italians in the mid-19th century in Britain. And I just want to make sure, this is probably one of the only other books written about Italians in Britain at this point. So if you're interested. But ice cream was still popular. I mean, it was growing. People were figuring out technology was getting better. We could actually have a little bit of refrigeration. So you're seeing a few more people sell ice cream by, say, the 1850s, 1860s. Not too many yet. So we do still see a few advertisements for them. But it's the Italians that really do this. So they're doing the statues, that helps a little bit. They're doing the organ grinding. But very quickly, Italian immigrants figured out that selling ice cream, which is so common in Italy, which they call gelato, of course. It's just ice cream. It's really good ice cream. It's just ice cream. They figured out no one's really doing this. There's just a few guys doing it. and they're not even doing it very well. We can make a lot of money doing this. So they become known as the Hokey Pokey Men. You probably know the old song, put your right foot in, put your right foot out, shake it, whatever, do the hokey pokey. Well, that song goes back to the early 1800s, but it used to be called a bunch of the Looby Loo and a bunch of other names. We get the hokey pokey from about 1940 when we get that name. And the name actually comes from these ice cream sellers. They were known as the Hokey Pokey Men. And they kind of leaned into it. They started calling themselves that. The reason they were called Hokey Pokey Men was because they were speaking in Italian. And we've all imitated other languages. Probably shouldn't do that, but we've all done it. And there's certain sounds we make. When British people heard Italian, they kind of heard it differently. So instead of gelato, ecco un poco, which means ice cream, got a little bit here, got a little ice cream for you, they would hear hokey pokey, and so that's what they started calling them. So again, the sellers actually leaned to it, just started calling themselves Hokey Pokey Men. Everybody knew that meant ice cream. The Hokey Pokey Man is coming. And so they started selling on the street, but then eventually got enough money to start opening up some little shops around Scotland. But not long after that, you start seeing these in newspapers. 20 persons poisoned by ice cream. Poisonous ice cream. Yesterday afternoon, this is the one, I believe, in Lambeth. You start seeing these stories about people being poisoned, again, by eating ice cream. And the impression that some of these articles give is that the person making the ice cream, Italians, are doing this on purpose. They are literally poisoning people. And there are a lot of real cases of people actually getting sick and even dying from eating ice cream. We see a big case, 75 people got extremely ill in Iowa in the 1860s. And many almost died. In London, we see a whole family die from eating ice cream. We've had a president that may have died from eating iced milk. Zachary Taylor in 1850 died of probably food poisoning, and we know he had some iced milk that day, and he died. It was on 4th of July, and he died. So in other words, this stuff is actually a real problem, it turns out. So again, ice cream is ice and milk, maybe cream, maybe some sugar, obviously the rock salt around it. You make it, you need some water, you need to clean things out. If you're living in a place with no running water, you have to go get water from somewhere else. You don't have good refrigeration. You don't have always good ice. What's going to start happening is that you'll freeze it. The ice cream will start melting. You're probably not washing your hands. This is a time when people didn't really know much about germs. And even if they did, a lot of these Italian immigrants weren't trained in this yet. This just wasn't common knowledge. Even doctors didn't wash their hands until about the 1880s, 1890s. James Garfield partly died because doctors didn't wash their hands when they were trying to get the bullet out of them. So there's already problems throughout the West at this point. This is right on the cusp of modern medicine. Just as modern medicine is coming in, just as there's the idea of what germs are and what sanitation is. And then ice cream is coming in right in that period. So ice cream itself could be dangerous no matter who made it. The milk can go sour and microbes can get into the milk. The water may not be clean. One of the big problems with water systems is that often sewage lines would literally enter into the drinking water lines. So you can get diseases that way. If the person making ice cream is not washing their hands, they may be spreading germs from themselves into the ice cream. Also, once you make ice cream, it might melt, and then they refreeze it. And you should know, if you ever freeze food and then thaw it out, never refreeze it. Because microbes are going to get in there, and then you're freezing the microbes, you're locking them in. So like once you thaw that meat out, you better eat it or throw it out. Don't refreeze that meat. That's what's happening with this ice cream. Dirty facilities, dirty water, refreezing ice cream over and over. I mean, this is a problem for all ice cream makers. But for these very poor Italian immigrants who are forced to live in places with no running water, no toilet facilities, and this is the way they're making money, yeah, ice cream was pretty dirty, in fact. One of the diseases that comes up a lot with these poisonings turns out to be cholera. If you take world history with me, I talk quite a bit about cholera. Cholera is basically, I'll be nice tonight, it's a waterborne disease, which really means feces is spreading this. So again, usually from not washing your hands and then you touch food and somebody eats it and they get cholera. Cholera is something that's actually horrendous, although it's easily cured. Clean water will cure it. But if you don't have clean water, you're in trouble. You literally have diarrhea till you die. You lose all your water. So people are eating ice cream and they might get cholera. They might get typhoid, another feces-borne disease. Getting ready for some ice cream? So cholera is not really much of a problem in the West today, but it is still a problem in certain parts of the world even to this day. But again, around the 1880s, we start seeing the discovery of germs, the actual identification of germs. And so suddenly, sanitation takes off. So ice cream really was a problem for a while. It was a legitimate fear, but it was a short-lived problem. Once they started getting good sanitation, we can start seeing the ways of making ice cream suddenly improve. But some of these medical journals do indeed describe kind of the reality of what making ice cream was like in, say, the 1880s. For instance, Street Life of London, which was a book about the poor of London, talks quite a bit about these hokey-pokey men. And the way it worked was they would walk around, hokey-pokey, right? You go up for a penny, maybe a half penny, and you can make your own jokes, but it was a penny a lick, as they called it. You would get a little glass bowl, no spoon, because spoons are expensive, they can be lost. You get a bowl, and you pay your penny, and you literally lick it out, hand the bowl back, wipe it out with a rag. All right, who's next? All right, there you go, same bowl. Eventually, once sanitation came in, they started using wafers instead of bowls, and then that turned into the cone. So this is the original ice cream cone before it was an ice cream cone. So again, no one's really cleaning this out, so you might be 100 people licked out of that bowl. And it's probably, if it's been washed, it probably was washed in water that was absolutely not clean, maybe even sewer infested. Again, not a big surprise that people were having problems with ice cream. But by 1900, it's not a problem anymore. You have sanitation departments in Edinburgh and Glasgow and London. You have regular inspections that are happening. This is from 1902. I know you can't read it, but it says 304 visits have been made to dairies and ice cream shops. As a result of these, 2 ice cream dealers were reported for keeping dirty conditions in their place. 2. In 1900, the first year they were doing this, in Edinburgh alone, one inspector made 5,000 visits to ice cream shops and didn't see one case of dirty premises. So again, by 1900, they literally had cleaned up their act because they knew better now. Everybody understood how to do that. So that fear starts to go away a little bit. And then you would get the next fear, crime. There's this idea that Italians are very criminal. They're very violent. There was a little truth to the fact that there was some crime done by Italian immigrants. I've gone through the police records. There are some crimes. There's no getting around it. But there was a lot of crime going on in Scotland at this point that wasn't Italian. But because it was Italians, that got magnified in the newspapers. Most of these crimes are very minor, somebody beating somebody else up, but we do see some murders. It's mostly Italian on Italian crime. It was mostly young men, no wives at this point in the early days, few children. Most of them were very poor. They felt angry. They were marginalized. And Italy at this point did have kind of an honor culture, kind of like the South, and where you get insulted, you got to pay it back. So that's sort of what's feeding this a little bit. And there are a couple of really horrendous cases. I've gone through some of the cases at the National Archives in Scotland. This was a case, again, 2 Italians that went after each other. You can see a couple of the names are ice cream sellers. That was, again, the main job for most Italians. This is probably the worst case, the Calabisi case. This guy actually did kill his whole family. He was actually married and killed his kids. But this was an extreme case. But it made huge news. It made everybody think all Italians are violent, all Italians are criminals. Again, we do see a little bit of that in the early days, but by the time you get around 1900, there's really not that much Italian crime going on. It was fairly short-lived and very much exaggerated. In fact, most of the crime you see is actually done by non-Italian Scottish people. All right. And by 1900, we start getting wives, we start getting children. They're settling down. They're even maybe becoming middle class. They're actually opening up ice cream shops. So those early days have gone now. But the fears have not. There is still this idea that ice cream shops are a problem. So this is one of the pamphlets that Glasgow published. And it talks about, it kind of begins like, oh, they're not that bad. But it turns out that many of these shops, owing to the way that they are conducted, the hours during which they keep open, become contributing factors to the downfall of many boys and girls. They're still the problem, though. The problem with our kids, again, are these ice cream shops. They're staying open too late. They're open on Sundays. Basically, this is how you learn to go to the pub and drink. You go to the ice cream shop late, you eat some ice cream, you gamble, you meet girls, you meet boys. It's just pub life without the alcohol. You're learning how to be a sinner, in other words. And again, that's our buddy Samuel Chisholm. Now this is why he's starting to act the way he acts. It's not crime anymore. It's not health. It's the influence on our kids. That's the real problem. We see this today a little bit in Britain. Back then, pubs stayed open until 10 o'clock, then they had to shut down. Today, it's about 1 a.m. But you have places like kebab shops that sell shawarma, which everybody learned about after Avengers, and gyro wraps and doner kebabs and all of this. And they tend to stay open about 3 or 4 a.m. So it's very common if you go to the pub and then they close and you get the munchies, you go to one of these places and you eat because it's the only place open. If you don't go to one of these, you might go to a fish and chip shop, or you might get some fried pizza, a big delicacy in Scotland, or you might go to KFC. KFC stays open all night in Scotland, and you don't want to go after about 11 o'clock because it is nothing but pub guys in there, all drunk. These are the modern day ice cream shops, in other words. You get done, for me it was Denny's and Village Inn when I was younger. I don't know what it is today, what people do after they get done partying, they don't want to go home yet. So, there's a big push. We don't want kids learning how to go to pubs, and we don't want people wandering around at night after the pubs are closed. We want them to go home. We got to get rid of these ice cream shops. They're the problem. So a lot of the leaders of Glasgow and Edinburgh and Aberdeen and Stirling and St. Andrews start approaching the Secretary for Scotland. Parliament has to do something. We have to shut these places down. At least shut them down on Sundays. Let's at least close them early at night. But we really just want to get rid of them altogether. And there are documents after documents of people in Scotland asking for this. We want these ice cream shops to go away. They finally get a law. 1903, Parliament does pass a law. They think Scotland's nuts for this. But they go, all right. They pass this huge police bill. And one part of it, Part 2, Section 80, allows authorities in Scotland to make ice cream shops register and get licensed before they can sell ice cream. They can also set the hours specifically for ice cream shops. But they can't close them on Sunday. They're going to stay open on Sundays. One of the big problems with this law is, how do you define an ice cream shop? So Parliament said it's a place that sells only ice cream. So if you're an ice cream shop owner, what are you going to do? You're going to start selling like tobacco. You're going to start selling candy. You're going to sell something other than just ice cream. So now you're just a store. You're just a restaurant. But the one cool thing about this, and again, this is in Dundee. After that law, you go, here's your rules now. We're going to get licensed. We're going to inspect you. But for me, the cool thing is now we have a listing of all the ice cream shops. So this is a listing in Edinburgh for the licenses. There are 162 ice cream shops just in Edinburgh, a town of about 150,000 at that point. And almost every one of them owned by an Italian family. So we can actually kind of document exactly who owned these and exactly where they are located. So I actually did walk around Edinburgh this summer, and actually this is called the Royal Mile. And there were still a couple ice cream shops, but unfortunately most of the original ones are long gone. They're now tourist shops. So these are all the old ice cream shops. Now they're, again, probably making better business selling tourist stuff to us. Anyway, we do see some other licenses a little bit later, like 1909, 1910. By that point, it's interesting. It's not as many Italians at that point. In other words, other Scots are starting to get in on the business. They're realizing, like, oh, this is good business, and they're clearly not going to get rid of us. So we do start seeing non-Italians getting involved in the business. All right. I know I'm starting to run late, so I'm not going to look at the time, but I know I'm getting close. So, it didn't stop, though. They did register the shops. They were inspecting the shops. But people still wanted to get rid of ice cream shops. They're still a problem. They're described constantly as evil. They are bringing our kids down. So they're trying again to shut down these shops. This is modern research today. You take pictures and you go home and you do your research. This is just one screen of about 10 screens that I have. Of each one of those is a document of a complaint to the Secretary for Scotland to get rid of ice cream shops. This was an obsession in Scotland for about 10 years. I'm trying to decide how far I want to go on this. Okay. Let me get to this one. So, again, this is now 1909, and Glasgow in particular is still trying to shut these down. And again, notice the words they keep using. To the great and increasing evil to the youth, male and female of the city, through their frequenting of ice cream shops. So in 1907, there was another big attempt, a huge debate in Parliament. Can we shut down ice cream shops on Sunday? Scotland is the land of Adam Smith, the guy who came up with capitalism, the free market. Parliament cannot believe, like, you want to shut business down? No, we're not going to do that. If we shut them down, we have to shut all stores down. We're not going to do that. If you want to close on Sunday, great, but we're not going to pass a national law to do that. Even though some pretty big-wig members of Parliament from Scotland did write these laws to try to get them passed. And again, Lubbock, in one of his letters, describes the pernicious influence of ice cream shops on our young men and women. Again, the same language over and over and over. Secretary of Scotland thought they were nuts. Parliament thought they were nuts. In fact, Lord Linlithgow, another Secretary for Scotland, literally said at one point, I literally see no problem here. The only problem I see, perhaps, maybe is the shebeening. By the way, that means selling alcohol without a license. Other than that, just didn't really see a problem with these. So they tried again. One more time. There was a huge push by the mayors and the town councils and the preachers in Scotland to get rid of those darn ice cream shops. And they turned to one of the people who ran a prison just outside of Glasgow. It's still around today. And he published a huge report, his evidence. This was supposed to be damning evidence that, by golly, ice cream is terrible for our youth, and we need to get rid of it. But I have actual documentation of this. So he went through his young prisoners, this is in 1911, and interviewed them. And basically, essentially went, so you're in here for what, robbery? You're in here for murder? You're in here for stealing? All right. Did you go to an ice cream shop? Yes. You went to an ice cream shop? They all went to ice cream shops. Therefore, ice cream shops are making them murderers. So here's some of the language from it. Youth, 22 years old, assault and robbery. Enjoyed himself as a lad in these ice cream places. Youth, 19 years old, once in prison, theft by housebreaking, played at dominoes, kept late hours, indeed made his father angry for staying out so late. Where is he going to stay out? The only place open? Ice cream shop, of course. Over and over again. 19 years in prison 5 times before, up to 16 years of age. I love the italics. He used to go to these ice cream shops. Now he goes to pubs. They trained him how to go to pubs. Again, over and over again, making this connection between ice cream shops and crime. Let's see, I got one more. Okay, this is from a reverend, 1910. One of my members, a most excellent woman, is greatly grieved and concerned about her son. A nice, kindly fellow, but somewhat weak and easily led. She blames ice cream shops very largely for his ruin. Some time ago, she told me that from her window, she could see the back window of one such shop, and she assured me that long ago it was professedly closed for the night, and sometimes to all hours of the morning. The back windows were brilliantly lit, so I know they were doing bad. I don't know what they were doing, but they were doing bad stuff. They were probably drinking and gambling and who knows what else. A little girl named Blank, age 9 years old, belonging to our Blank Sunday school. So can't verify any of this. All the evidence is taken. Was playing one afternoon in Phoenix Park. This is actually not a nice story, by the way. It's not a funny one. She was enticed by the keeper of an ice cream shop into a shop. It was assaulted. Terrible story. But at the same time, it's not the ice cream. That was just obviously a horrible person. So they're really trying hard to push this. At that point, the Secretary for Scotland was like, really? We're still doing this? You guys have done this? So, all right, I'll try one more time. I'll go down to Parliament. That's some pretty bad evidence. Maybe they'll be convinced. So in 1911, Parliament, the head of the British Empire, debated this, and they decided, all right, the 1903 one didn't work. We'll give you one more power to shut down ice cream shops. The problem is we can't identify one shop. That's bad. So what we're going to say is you can tell all places of refreshment what their hours are. And if you want to shut them all down on Sunday, go for it. That ain't happening. All these other restaurants, all these other places, they're not going to get shut down on Sunday. So pretty much the sheriffs of the towns refused to enforce the law. The town councils refused to write their own bylaws. So this was dead on arrival. And basically it was Parliament calling their bluff. You really care about this? Shut them all down. Didn't work. Partly by 1911, we're into 30, 40 years of ice cream and Italians in Scotland. The teenagers of the 1880s and 90s, they're the adults now. They're the politicians now. Italian culture, including ice cream, is now part of Scottish culture. There's still fears. We do see a few more attempts in 1912, 1913. There's a little bit more. You can still see the use of language of, we got to get rid of this evil. But Thomas Wood, they go to him again, and he says, nope, I'm the laughing stock of Parliament asking for this. I ain't doing this anymore. We're done. There was going to be one big more push. And then 1914 happened. A guy named the Archduke of Austria, Franz Ferdinand, was assassinated. And suddenly, by August of 1914, Europe was aflame in World War I. Suddenly, ice cream shops don't seem all that important. And as British soldiers, English, Welsh, Scottish, going off to fight, going off to France to fight, one of the things they're thinking about is, oh, I wish I was home. I wish I could go to one of those little ice cream shops again. I wish I could see a Hokey Pokey man again. And we actually do see letters where people are talking about they're missing the ice cream and such. So once we get past World War I, it's like nobody cares. Real problems have happened. And again, by 1920, again, Italians are now just Scots. They're Italo-Scots, but there's a lot of people who are Italian that you wouldn't even know it. And the one, this would have been a bigger deal probably about 5 years ago. He may not be as familiar to some of you today, but if anybody's a Doctor Who fan, you might remember that a few years ago there was a Doctor Who played by Peter Capaldi. Peter Capaldi is Italo-Scot. His family were one of these ice cream families. I don't think anybody thinks of Peter Capaldi as Italian. They think of him as Scottish. And really by 1920, that was already the case. Today in Scotland, if you want to go for ice cream, you don't say this, because it is a little bit incorrect, but for older generations, you will go for a tally. I'm going to go get a tally. Tally coming from Italian, meaning getting ice cream. So ice cream is still associated with Italians to this day. Nardini's is probably the premier ice cream place. Now it's a fancy restaurant. But instead of being a negative connection, Italians and ice cream, it is now a positive connection. It is something Scotland celebrates today. But it took World War I to kind of make that change happen. The only other thing I want to say before I let go of you guys is, and this is like Amway, I'm selling you something now. If you actually are interested in Scotland and you want to get some Scottish ice cream, I do a Scotland Study Abroad program. In the back, I do have a little sign-up sheet. We have an extra credit sign-up sheet. That's the notepad. So if anybody didn't have a sheet to sign in on the notepad. I'll make sure all your professors get it. But I also have a little sign-up sheet for the Scotland Study Abroad program. If you're interested in maybe going, we're going to do a program next week after Thanksgiving. So in the STEPS classroom, which is in the library, on November 29th at 4 p.m., we're going to have a program on Scottish program. And online on December 2nd, I'm going to do an online session for students all over Georgia. So I'll just leave that up there. It has my email on it if you're interested. Sorry to do little sales at the end. I know it's kind of cheesy, but I got your attention. I'm talking about Scotland. I can't not talk about the program. Other than that, I'm done. So hopefully, thank you. Well, thank you for coming.